The story of Movladi Atlangeriyev is not just a tale of crime, it is a dark mirror held up to a turbulent era, a chronicle of how chaos, ambition, and brutality can forge a figure of near mythical power and infamy. To understand the man who would become the minister, one must first understand the world that created him. He was born in 1965, not in the heart of Chechnya but in the neighboring Ingush region, a detail that would later become a subtle footnote in his complex identity within the Chechen criminal and political milieu. His childhood unfolded against the grim, monolithic backdrop of the late Soviet Union, an empire that was outwardly rigid and controlled but was already showing deep, terminal cracks. The Chechen Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was a place of proud martial traditions, suppressed nationalism, and simmering resentment against Moscow's rule. For a young Movladi, the environment was a rigorous school of survival. It was a world where official Soviet ideology clashed daily with deep-rooted clan loyalty, where respect was often measured by strength and defiance rather than compliance. There are no records of a particularly privileged or deprived upbringing. Rather, he emerged from the crucible of Caucasian life where every boy learned early that authority was something to be tested, and that one's own kin and code were the ultimate sources of security and law. This formative period instilled in him the quintessential traits of a Chechen abrek, the outlaw hero of Caucasian folklore, but stripped of the romanticism, replaced instead with a cold, pragmatic understanding of power dynamics. He served his compulsory military service in the Soviet armed forces, a rite of passage that for young men from the Caucasus was an exercise in enduring institutionalized racism and harsh discipline. For Atlangeriyev, however, the army was less an indoctrination into Soviet patriotism and more a finishing school in hierarchy, logistics, and the application of organized force. He learned the structure of command, the movement of material, and, most importantly, he built a network of connections with other young men from across the vast Soviet landscape, many of whom would find themselves adrift and heavily armed in the coming years of collapse. Following his military service, he returned to a Chechnya that was increasingly restless. The winds of perestroika and glasnost were blowing from Moscow, but in Grozny they fanned the flames of ancient aspirations for independence. It was in this volatile pre-war atmosphere that Atlangeriyev, like many of his contemporaries, drifted into the burgeoning shadow economy. The late 1980s Soviet Union was a paradise for black marketeers. State controls were failing, shortages were rampant, and a new class of entrepreneurs, the Tsekoviks, were making fortunes. With his natural authority, military-honed organizational skills, and a complete lack of reverence for Soviet law, Movladi quickly established himself in this gray zone. He started with small-time racketeering and hustling, but his ambitions were far grander than controlling a few street markets. He understood that real power lay not in petty theft, but in controlling essential commodities. His sharp mind identified the two most valuable currencies in the coming chaos: weapons and fuel, even before the first bullet of the Chechen Wars was fired. Atlangeriyev was positioning himself as a pivotal node in the nascent criminal political complex. He cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, with disaffected military officers who had access to armories, and with other rising strongmen. His reputation grew not as a mindless thug, but as a shrewd, calculating, and fiercely disciplined operator. He was building a corporation, and its business was influence. The eruption of the First Chechen War in 1994 was the catalyst that transformed ambitious criminals into warlords and kingmakers. As the Russian army bombed Grozny into rubble and a fierce guerrilla war erupted, the already weak structures of the state vanished completely. In this anarchic landscape, power flowed from the barrel of a gun and the control of supply lines. Atlangeriyev's pre-war preparations paid off handsomely. He and his organized group, now a well-armed militia loyal primarily to him, became masters of the shadows. They controlled key corridors for smuggling weapons into Chechnya for the resistance, and just as crucial, they controlled the flow of pilfered Russian military supplies and, increasingly, oil products. The war created a bizarre, horrifying economy where humanitarian aid, weapons, and oil were all part of the same deadly barter system. Movladi Atlangeriyev proved to be a master economist of this hellscape. consolidating his power with ruthless efficiency. While the world's attention was fixed on the dramatic battles between Dudoyev's separatists and the Russian army, he was operating in the spaces between the warring sides, a sovereign force in his own right. The end of the First Chechen War in 1996 did not bring peace. It brought a lawless interregnum where the spoil of conflict were divided, and new kingdoms were carved from the ruins. The Kaucasus Accord signed a fragile peace, but it left the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria a shattered, unrecognized state, devoid of a functioning economy or any legitimate institution. Into this power vacuum stepped men like Movladi Atlangeriyev, now no longer just a shadowy operator but a central pillar of a new, criminalized order. His control over the smuggling of oil products, gasoline, diesel, kerosene became the bedrock of his empire. The process was brazen and systematic. Chechnya was, and still is, crisscrossed by pipelines carrying crude oil from the Caspian Sea to Russian refineries. The war had damaged many of these, and the maintenance and security infrastructure had collapsed entirely. Atlangeriyev's men, often disguised as official guards or simply operating with impunity, would tap into these pipelines at remote location. These were not small-scale siphoning operations. They were industrial-scale diversion. They constructed hidden bypasses and makeshift refineries in mountain gorges and forest clearings, a sprawling, clandestine industry that hemorrhaged millions of dollars worth of resources from the Russian state. The stolen oil products were then moved through a complex logistics network that Atlangeriyev commanded. This network involved corrupt officials on both sides of the Chechen-Russian administrative border, trucking companies owned through frontmen, and storage facilities across the North Caucasus. The product would be sold on the black market, laundered through shell companies, or traded directly for weapons, cars, and other goods. This immense revenue stream did more than just make Atlangeriyev wealthy. It made him politically indispensable. He became the financier, the paymaster. He could fund militia units, influence political appointments, and ensure the loyalty of entire clans by controlling the flow of the region's most vital economic resource. It was during this period, roughly 1997, that the moniker the minister became cemented. It was a title born from dark humor and genuine fear. In a republic with a phantom government, he effectively operated as the Minister of Oil and Energy, controlling the lifeblood of the territory with an authority that the actual president, Aslan Maskadov, could only dream of. Maskadov, a former Soviet artillery officer elected in 1997, found his presidency crippled from the start. He had nominal authority, but the real power was distributed among powerful field commanders, mafia bosses like Atlangeriyev, who commanded their own private armies and revenue streams. The relationship between the formal leader and the shadow minister was one of fraught, tense coexistence. Maskadov needed Atlangeriyev's resources to even attempt to govern, but Atlangeriyev's criminal empire was a primary source of the lawlessness that was destroying Chechnya's credibility and pushing it towards another war with Russia. Atlangeriyev, for his part, had no interest in a strong central state. A weak, distracted government in Grozny was perfect for his operation. He reportedly viewed Maskadov with contempt, seeing him as an ineffectual figurehead, unable to comprehend the brutal realities of the new world they inhabited. Beyond oil, Atlangeriev diversified his portfolio into another lucrative and terrifying enterprise, kidnapping for ransom. This was not the random crime of desperate individuals. It was a highly organized corporate undertaking. His group, operating with military precision, would target specific individuals, foreign aid workers, journalists, Russian businessmen, and even officials operating in or near Chechnya. The kidnappings were meticulously planned, often based on intelligence gathered from corrupt contacts. The victims would be taken to secret prisons, often in mountain villages where Atlangeriev's authority was absolute. Negotiations were conducted not with hysterical demands, but with the cold calculation of a CFO. Ransoms, often in the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, were set. Payment was non-negotiable. Failure to pay or attempts at rescue by Russian force would result in the delivery of a gruesome videotape or a severed finger. The money flowed in, further bolstering his power and creating an atmosphere of such terror that even the Russian state apparatus often seemed paralyzed. Atlangeriev was not merely a criminal, He was a challenge to the very concept of the state, creating a parallel system of taxation, justice, and enforcement that was far more efficient and brutal than the official one. His power was personal, built on a mix of fear, patronage, and a perverse sense of honor. He was known to be ruthless with traitors and competitors, but loyal and generous to those who served him well. He presented himself as a defender of Chechen interests, a necessary evil in a time of national catastrophe, a man who provided jobs and security where the government could not. This duality, the murderous gangster and the paternalistic provider, was key to his enduring influence. He understood that in a land ravaged by war, survival was the only ideology that mattered, and he positioned himself as the ultimate guarantor of survival for those under his wing. By the late 1990s, Movladi Atlangeriyev sat at the apex of a vast, hybrid criminal state entity. He had his own army, his own treasury, his own foreign policy conducted through kidnappings and smuggling deals, and his own domestic policy enforced by terror. He was, for all intents and purposes, a sovereign within a non-sovereign state, a dark star whose gravitational pull was warping the very fate of the Chechen nation. The Kremlin, watching from Moscow, saw in him and his ilk the ultimate proof that Chechnya was a bandit republic beyond redemption, a narrative that would soon be used to justify a second, even more devastating war. The fragile, nightmare peace of the late 90s was a ticking bomb, and its detonation came in the summer of 1999 with the invasion of Dagestan by radical Islamist forces based in Chechnya, followed swiftly by a series of apartment bombings in Russia that were blamed on Chechen terrorists. This provided the casus belli for a newly appointed Prime Minister of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who promised to wipe out the terrorists in the outhouse. The Second Chechen War, beginning in September 1999, was a cataclysm of a different order than the first. It was no longer a war for independence, but a counter-terrorist operation characterized by overwhelming, indiscriminate Russian military force and a strategic determination to dismantle Chechnya's sovereignty entirely. For Movladi Atlangeriyev, this new war presented both an existential threat and a fleeting opportunity. His empire, built on the anarchy of a weak state, now faced the prospect of annihilation by a vengeful and resurgent Russian military machine determined to burn out the cancer of separatism and criminality root and stem. Initially, like many of the powerful field commanders and criminal leaders he saw the conflict as another chaotic environment to be navigated for profit. The early months of the war saw a frantic scramble. His smuggling networks went into overdrive, now moving not just oil and contraband, but also funneling weapons and fighters, and extracting wealth ahead of the advancing Russian troops. However, the Russian strategy this time was brutally comprehensive. They would not just defeat the army, but systematically eliminate all alternative centers of power. This meant that figures like Atlangeriyev, the so-called power ministers of the Maskada government, were not just enemies by association, they were primary targets. The Kremlin's plan involved not only military force, but also a sophisticated and ruthless campaign of co-option, divide and rule, targeted assassination. It was during this period that Atlangeriyev's path took a dramatic and fateful turn. Facing the overwhelming might of the Russian forces, a deep schism opened within the Chechen resistance. On one side stood the nationalist secular remnants loyal to President Aslan Maskarov, who sought a political solution. On the other stood the increasingly dominant Islamist faction, led by warlords like Shamil Basayev, the Arab fighter Ibn al-Khattab, who advocated for a pan-Caucasian jihad under strict Sharia law, for a pragmatic criminal capitalist like Atlangeriyev, whose power was based on clan loyalty, secular business dealings, and a code of personal honor rather than religious ideology. The rise of the Islamists was as great a threat as the Russian. The Wahhabi-inspired radicals viewed his oil smuggling empire as haram, his kidnapping for profit as banditry, and his entire worldview as anathema to their goal of an Islamic emirate. They were not potential partners. They were competitors seeking to impose a theocratic order that would destroy his criminal enterprise. This placed Atlangeriyev in an impossible triangulation, hunted by the Russians, distrusted by Maskado's official but feeble government, and openly hostile to the ascendant jihadist wing of his own people. It was from this position of extreme peril that he made the most consequential decision of his life. he began secret negotiations with the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. The exact timeline and terms of this betrayal remained shrouded in the murky world of espionage. But by early 2000, as Russian troops cemented their control over Grozny and the plains, Atlangeriyev effectively switched sides. This was not a surrender, it was a strategic realignment. He offered the Russians what they desperately needed: deep, granular intelligence on the inner workings of the Chechen resistance, the location of hideouts, the supply routes of the jihadists, the identities of key figures, and the complex web of clan alliances. In return, he sought survival, amnesty for his past crimes, and a place, however, diminished within the new power structure that the Kremlin was building. In Chechnya, a structure that would soon be personified by a young, brutal former mufti named Akhmat Kadyrov, whom Putin was installing as his proxy. For the Russians, Atlangeriyev was an intelligence goldmine. His defection was a monumental propaganda coup, proof that the bandits were fragmenting. More practically, his information led to deadly ambushes, targeted killings, and the disruption of rebel logistics. He became a key asset in the FSB's Chechenization strategy, pitting Chechen against Chechen to bleed the resistance dry. For Atlangeriyev, this period was one of precarious duality. He was now a collaborator, living under Russian protection, likely in a secure compound either in Chechnya or a neighboring region. He would have been constantly guarded, his movements controlled, his communications monitored. The lavish, autonomous power of his minister days was gone, replaced by the constrained existence of a highly valuable but utterly expendable asset. He was a tool, and he knew it. Yet, he also wielded a terrible power of his own, the power of the traitor. Who knows where all the bodies are buried? He would have been forced to participate in identifying former comrades, perhaps even in operations against them. Every piece of intelligence he provided was a blood oath with his new masters and a death sentence from his old world. The psychological toll must have been immense, a constant calculus of fear and survival. His family, his remaining loyalists, all became hostages to his cooperation. Meanwhile, on the other side, a fatwa was effectively issued on his life. To the Islamist fighters and even to many nationalist Chechens disgusted by his betrayal, Movladi Atlangeriyev became a top priority target, a symbol of everything they were fighting against: corruption, collaboration, and the sacrifice of the nation's cause for personal survival. He was now living on borrowed time, caught between the ruthless pragmatism of his Russian handlers and the unforgiving vengeance of his former peers. His empire of oil and terror had crumbled, but his knowledge made him more dangerous, and thus more vulnerable than ever before. He had traded the throne of a shadow state for the gilded cage of an informant, and the walls of that cage were closing in with each passing day. Each secret he revealed, and each old ally he condemned to death. The years following his defection, from roughly 2001 to 2004, were a twilight existence for Movladi Atlangeriyev, a protracted and tense interlude where he was neither the fearsome minister of old nor a truly free man. He existed in a netherworld, a spectral figure whose name was whispered in both fear and hatred across the ravaged Chechen landscape. Under the formal protection of the FSB, his life became a regiment, sequence of safe houses, guarded movements, and debriefing sessions. His value was not in his continued criminal operations, which were largely dismantled or taken over by others, but in the vast repository of information inside his head. He became a living database, a key to decrypting the complex and shifting alliances of the Chechen insurgency. His debriefings would have been exhaustive, spanning years of history, the inner workings of Maskadov's failed administration, the financial pipelines that sustained the fighters, the intricate smuggling routes through Georgia and Azerbaijan, the identities of corrupt Russian officials who had facilitated his old empire, and more critically, the personalities, tactics, and hideouts of the jihadist commanders like Basayev and Khattab. This intelligence was instrumental in shaping the Kremlin's brutal pacification campaign. Raids were launched based on his tips, ambushes were set, and safe houses were stormed. His collaboration directly contributed to the decapitation of the resistance's logistical and financial networks. For the Russian security services, he was a trophy and a weapon of immense utility. However, This period was also one of intense psychological erosion. The man who had once commanded his own fate was now a dependent, his every need and security provided by his handlers, a constant reminder of his diminished stature. The autonomy that had been the core of his power was utterly gone. He was likely kept under a form of luxurious but strict house arrest, allowed certain comforts but denied any real agency. The bravado and authority of the warlord had to be suppressed, replaced by the compliant demeanor of the asset. This would have been a profound humiliation for a figure of his pride and background. Furthermore, the moral weight of his betrayal was inescapable. He knew that every piece of information he surrendered could lead to the deaths, perhaps of men he had once fought beside, or even distant relatives caught in the dragnet. The Chechen conflict was a war of clans and blood feuds. His actions would have brought not just political condemnation but the eternal, inheritable hatred of entire families and types. The code of Nokchala, the Chechen ethical system emphasizing honor, loyalty, and vengeance, had been irrevocably violated by him. His name was now Mud, synonymous with Shalgo, a collaborator. This internal conflict, the struggle between the will to survive and the crushing guilt of betrayal, would have been his constant companion. Simultaneously, the external threat was omnipresent and growing. The insurgency, though battered, was adapting. The jihadist wing, in particular, was becoming more ruthless and ideologically driven. They had long lists of traitors to punish, and at the top of that list was Movladi Atlangeriyev. His continued existence was a living insult to their cause, and a dangerous leak in their security. They had networks of sympathizers and sleeper cells, even in areas under firm Russian military control. A bounty, both financial and spiritual, would have been placed on his head. His Russian guards were a deterrent, but not an impenetrable shield. Every trip outside his secure location, every leak of his whereabouts represented a catastrophic risk. The pressure from his Russian handlers would also have been relentless. They would have constantly pushed for more information, deeper betrayals, perhaps even wanting him to make public appearances or recorded statements to demoralize the resistance, a step that would have made him even more of a target. This dynamic created a horrifying paradox. The more valuable he made himself by talking, the more the Russian needed to keep him alive in secret, but also the more desperate his enemies became to silence him. It was a tightening vice. During this time, the political landscape of Chechnya itself was being violently remolded. Akhmat Kadyrov, the former Mufti turned pro-Moscow leader, was consolidating power with Kremlin backing and brutal efficiency. Kadyrov was building his own power base, which involved co-opting some former fighters and exterminating others. For Atlangeriyev, Kadyrov represented another layer of danger. Kadyrov's strategy for control was to monopolize all power and violence within Chechnya. A figure like Atlangeriyev, with his independent notoriety, his deep knowledge, and his direct channel to the FSB in Moscow, was a potential rival, a loose end, and a symbol of the chaotic past that Kadyrov was trying to erase. It is unlikely that Kadyrov viewed the minister with anything but suspicion and jealousy. Atlangeriyev's continued survival depended not just on his FSB minders, but on navigating the treacherous politics between the central Russian security apparatus and the rising, volatile satrap in Grozny. By 2004 to 2005, the insurgency was morphing into a bitter, protracted guerrilla war and a campaign of terrorism. Major conventional battles were over, replaced by roadside bombs, assassinations and raids. In this environment, a high-profile traitor was a prime target for a spectacular hit. Atlangeriyev's utility to the Russians was also evolving. The bulk of his historical knowledge had likely been extracted. His current intelligence on the insurgency would have been growing stale. As the rebel networks adapted and new leaders emerged, his value was depreciating. In the cruel economy of espionage, an asset whose intelligence dividends are declining but whose maintenance cost in terms of security, financial upkeep, and political liability remains high, becomes a liability. Rumors and signs of his desire to break free from this gilded captivity may have begun to surface. Perhaps he chafed at the restrictions, dreamed of regaining some sliver of his former autonomy, or feared he was about to be deemed expendable and disposed of by his handlers. Some reports suggest he may have even attempted to re-establish faint, dangerous contacts with old worlds, a move that would have instantly triggered the deepest paranoia in his FSB overseers. He was trapped in a gilded cage whose door was locked from the outside, and the key was held by men who saw him as a file to be closed, not a life to be preserved. The stage was being set for the final act. The hunter turned prey, living on borrowed time under a foreign flag, was now caught in a triple bind, hunted by his former comrades who swore vengeance, viewed as a inconvenient relic by the local proxy regime in Chechnya, and increasingly seen as a depreciating asset by the powerful patrons in Moscow who held his leash. The calm, if paranoid, existence of the high-value informant was about to shatter, giving way to a much more volatile and dangerous phase, one that would lead him out of the shadows of safe houses and back in the treacherous sunlight of the Caucasus, where his past awaited him with a gun and a final, unforgiving judgment. The precise moment when the fragile equilibrium of Atlangeriev's protected existence shattered is lost in the fog of clandestine wars. But by 2006, it was clear the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. The Russian strategy in Chechnya had achieved its primary military objective, a brutal, grinding pacification. Grozny was being rebuilt with Moscow's money, and the rule, albeit a harsh one, of Ramzan Kadyrov, who succeeded his assassinated father Ahmed in 2004, was being firmly established. Kadyrov's regime was built on a simple, brutal principle: the complete and total monopoly of violence and patronage within Chechnya. All armed groups would be his, all financial flows would be under his control, and all significant figures would swear personal loyalty to him. Independent actors, especially those with their own legend and a direct line to Moscow, were intolerable. Movladi Atlangeriyev, the former minister, was the very definition of an independent actor. Despite his collaboration, he remained a symbol of a different kind of power, one based on criminal enterprise and personal fiefdom, rather than subservience to the Kadyrovite project. For Ramzan Kadyrov, a man obsessed with legacy and control, Atlangeriyev was a living ghost of a disorderly past that needed to be exorcised. Furthermore, Atlangeriev's knowledge was now a double-edged sword. He knew not only the secrets of the old resistance, but also potential the compromises, deals, and hidden crimes of the new regime's ascent. He was a walking archive of uncomfortable truths. His continued presence, even in a guarded villa, was a latent threat. Simultaneously, his value to his FSB handlers in Moscow was diminishing. The counterinsurgency had shifted. The enemy was no longer the structured forces of Maskadov or Basayev, both of whom were dead by 2005 and 2006 respectively, but a more fragmented, ideologically hardened insurgency operating in small cells. Atlangeriev's insights into this new reality were limited. He was a historian of a concluded war, not an analyst of the evolving one. The cost-benefit analysis in Moscow's security offices was likely turning against him. Maintaining a high security detail for a depreciating asset while simultaneously angering the increasingly important and volatile Ramzan Kadyrov became a poor strategic equation. It was within this toxic confluence of interests that Atlangeriev's protective veil began to thin. He may have sensed the shifting winds, the cooling of his reception from his handler, the subtle hints that his long-term safety could no longer be guaranteed. Perhaps there were off-the-record suggestions that he consider relocating, or veiled threats about the need for continued cooperation in new, riskier ways. This period marks the likely beginning of Atlangeriev's final desperate gambit, an attempt to reinvent himself once more, to regain agency by stepping out of the Russian shadow and negotiating a new position within the complex, deadly puzzle of the North Caucasus. Some reports and analyses suggest he may have attempted to reach out to other power centers. There were rumors of contacts with Georgian intelligence, of exploring the possibility of asylum in a third country, or even of fantastical attempts to reconcile with remnants of the insurgency, a move that would have been suicidal on all fronts. More plausibly, he might have sought to leverage his remaining knowledge and reputation to become a player in the region. Other simmering conflicts, like those in Ingushetia or Dagestan, where criminal and insurgent networks intertwined. This was the most dangerous game imaginable to his Russian minders. Any attempt to establish independent contacts would be seen as treasonous, double-dealing, justifying immediate and severe termination of his protected status to the Kadyrov regime. Any movement by Atlangeriyev outside his cage was a direct challenge, and to the Islamist insurgents, any hint of his whereabouts was a target opportunity. He was walking a tightrope over a pit of knives, blindfolded. The pressure culminated in what appears to have been a deliberate policy decision. A controlled release of the asset back into the wild, where the predators could finish the job. The security detail around him became less vigilant. Information about his location or movement may have been deliberately leaked, or he was given a false sense of confidence to venture out. He was being set up as bait, or more chillingly, he was being offered as a sacrificial pawn to appease Ramzan Kadyrov and solidify the Moscow-Grozny alliance. By 2007, Atlangeriyev was effectively a dead man walking, caught in a three-way trap. He could no longer rely on his Russian protectors, who were now facilitators of his end. He could not submit to Kadyrov, as that would mean surrendering to a man who saw him as a trophy to be eliminated, not a subordinate to be integrated. And he could never return to the world he betrayed. His only option was to run, to disappear. But in the small, intimate world of Caucasian clan networks where every stranger's noted and every loyalty had a price, a face as famous as his could never truly vanish, he spent his final years in a nomadic, paranoid flight, moving between obscure towns in Ingushetia, possibly Dagestan, and the remote mountain villages of Chechnya itself, returning to the terrain of his youth. But now, as a fugitive in his own homeland, he relied on a dwindling circle of old, personal loyalists from his clan, or those bound by ancient oaths, men whose sense of personal honor toward him outweighed the political and religious fatwas against him. But even this was a diminishing resource. The reach of the Kadyrovtsi Ramzan's personal militia was long, and their methods of persuasion, money, threats, and violence were potent. One by one, his potential safe houses were compromised, his contacts turned or silenced. He lived in cars, in temporary mountain huts, constantly looking over his shoulder, trusting no one completely, knowing that a single word from a disgruntled relative or a frightened host could spell his doom. The mighty minister who once commanded tankers of oil and held presidents to ransom was now reduced to worrying about clean water, a warm bed, and the loyalty of the man bringing him his next meal. This was his downfall, not in a dramatic battle, but in a slow, grinding erosion of everything. He had built his power, his protection, his network, and finally, his hope. The hunter was now the prey, and every shadow in the rugged Caucasian landscape hid a potential executioner sent from Grozny, from the insurgency, or even from Moscow, all of whom had finally found a common goal in the eradication of Movladi Atlangeriyev. The final descent of Movladi Atlangeriyev was a protracted and lonely siege against an inevitable fate, a masterclass in the erosion of a human spirit under the weight of omnipresent dread. From 2007 into 2008, his world contracted from a region to a handful of villages, from a network to a few terrified faces, from strategy to mere instinct. He was a ghost haunting the periphery of the very empire he had helped shape, a living testament to the fact that, in the remorseless, realpolitik of the post-war Caucasus, there were no permanent allies, only permanent interests, and his had expired. His existence became a series of grim routines governed by paranoia. Movements were planned under the cover of darkness, in unremarkable vehicles that were changed frequently. Communication was minimal, conducted through burnout phones and trusted couriers, who were themselves risking their lives. He could no longer trust the wider clan structure that once protected him, for the Kadyrov regime had perfected the art of turning clans against each other and against their own sons. A brother could be imprisoned, a father threatened, a cousin bought, all to force a betrayal. The financial reservoirs that once seemed bottomless were now inaccessible or exhausted, spent on buying silence and safe passage that was becoming impossibly expensive. He was living off the dwindling capital of his past reputation and the fading strength of oaths, a currency that was hyper-inflating into worthlessness with each passing month. The psychological toll must have been colossal. This was a man accustomed to command, to having his word translate instantly into action, to viewing the world as a chessboard he controlled. Now he was a pawn in someone else's endgame, reacting, hiding, surviving. The sheer boredom of confinement, mixed with the adrenaline of terror, creates a unique form of torture. Days would be spent in silent, stagnant safe houses, followed by sudden, frantic nighttime escapes on the rumor of an approaching checkpoint or a suspicious stranger in the village. His health, both physical and mental, likely began to deteriorate. The robust physique of the former soldier and warlord would have been weakened by stress, poor diet, and the constant tension. Sleep, when it came, would have been fractured and haunted by the ghosts of those he had killed, betrayed, or condemned. Every knock on the door, every engine idling outside for too long, every unexpected glance from a local would have sent his heart racing. He knew the methods of his pursuers intimately because they were once his own. Torture to extract information, the kidnapping of relatives, the silent knife, or the long-range rifle. His imagination would have been his own worst enemy, painting every mundane incident with the brush of impending doom. Meanwhile, the forces arrayed against him were tightening the noose with systematic efficiency. Ramzan Kadyrov's security apparatus, now a vastly powerful and feared institution, had made his elimination a top priority. It was a matter of consolidating power and sending a message. No one from the old era, no matter how powerful they once were, operates outside my control. Kadyrov's men, often former insurgents who had switched sides, knew the terrain and the mentality as well as Atlangeriyev did. They applied pressure at every possible point. They would raid villages, arresting anyone remotely connected to Atlangeriyev's family or old network, using interrogation methods that were notoriously brutal to glean any fragment of information, a sighting, a rumor, a guess. They turned his hunt into a collective punishment, making the cost of harboring him so high that even loyal hearts would crack under the strain. Financial incentives were also offered, a life-changing sum of money for information leading to his capture or death, a temptation that could pit neighbor against neighbor in the impoverished republic. Simultaneously, the Islamist insurgency had not forgotten him. For them, killing the minister would be a crowning propaganda victory, an act of divine vengeance against an apostate and a traitor. Their networks, though different from Kadyrov's, were embedded in the same communities. They too had informants and willing operatives. Atlangeriyev was thus trapped in a pincer movement between two ruthless enemies who, though fighting each other, found a rare point of agreement in the desire to see him dead. Even his former masters in Moscow had likely signed off on this outcome. His elimination would serve as a final gift to Kadyrov, a demonstration of Moscow's commitment to its proxy and a tidy way to close a messy file. All signals from the center would have indicated that the asset was now deniable, his life expendable for the greater geopolitical stability of the region. By the summer of 2008, the circle had become impossibly small. The recent memory of the brutal murder of his former comrade-turned-enemy, the infamous terrorist Shamil Basayev, in 2006 would have been a constant reminder of the reach and capability of his pursuers. If Russian intelligence could kill Basayev, they could certainly find him. The outbreak of the Russia-Georgia War in August 2008 added another layer of chaos and danger to the region, further militarizing the zone and making movement even more hazardous. Every stranger was a potential soldier, spy, or bounty hunter. Atlangeriyev's options had evaporated. Seeking asylum abroad was now a fantasy. Crossing any border required paperwork and exposure he could never risk. Surrendering to Kadyrov meant a humiliating show trial or, more likely, a silent disappearance into one of the regime's infamous secret prisons, followed by a summary execution. Returning to the insurgency was impossible. He would have been executed on the spot as a spy. He was left with only one option: to keep moving through the shrinking labyrinth of his homeland, waiting for the mistake, the betrayal, or the pinpoint strike that would end it all. His life in these final months was the ultimate negation of everything he had been. The king of a shadow economy was now a beggar for safety. The feared minister was now a tremor in the dark. The architect of kidnappings was now the ultimate hostage to his past, to his enemies, and to the relentless, unforgiving passage of time that was running out with the steady rhythm of a countdown clock. He was a man waiting for a bullet whose origin he might never know, whether it would come from a Kadyrovtsi loyalist, an Islamist avenger, or a professional from the Russian special services sent to tidy up loose ends. The only certainty was that it was coming, and every sunrise he saw was a stolen one. And when it finally came on September 24th, 2008, was not a grand battle or a dramatic last stand, but a swift, clinical, and almost anticlimactic act of violence that underscored the complete and utter eradication of his power. Movladi Atlangeriyev was in Ingushetia, the republic of his birth, a place where he might have hoped the tangled web of local loyalties and clan affiliations could offer one last, thin layer of sanctuary. He was in the city of Nazran, not hiding in a remote mountain cave, but in a residential setting, suggesting either a catastrophic lapse in his security protocol or, more likely, that his network had been so thoroughly compromised that every potential refuge was now a marked location. He was visiting a private house, a fact that itself indicates he still trusted somewhere, enough to believe in the safety of a temporary roof over his head. That trust was his final and fatal error. The operation that killed him was a signature strike, bearing all the hallmarks of a meticulous, planned intelligence-led assassination, not a chance encounter or a chaotic firefight. According to the official and sparse reports from the Russian authorities, officers from the Interior Ministry and the FSB were conducting a special operation to detain a wanted criminal. They claimed that when they approached the house, Atlangeriyev opened fire, prompting them to return fire and kill him. The narrative is the standard, almost theatrical script used for such events, designed to portray a lawful engagement and deny any hint of an extrajudicial execution. The reality, as understood by analysts and those familiar with the Caucasus, was almost certainly different. The likelihood is that his location had been betrayed, either through technical surveillance, the cracking of his dwindling circle, or a direct sellout by someone he considered an ally. The security forces would have surrounded the location with overwhelming force, cutting off any possible escape routes. The call to surrender, if it was even made, would have been a procedural formality. The goal was not capture. The goal was permanent elimination. The brief exchange of gunfire, whether it actually occurred or was merely staged for the report, was the final perfunctory punctuation mark on his life story. He was shot dead, along with at least one associate, in a mundane setting far removed from the pipelines and mountain passes that were the theaters of his former empire. The mighty minister fell not on a battlefield but in a suburban yard. The aftermath was characterized by a chilling and revealing silence. Ramzan Kadyrov, who had publicly vowed to destroy all bandits and terrorists, made no triumphant statement, took no public credit. His silence was itself a statement. It was beneath him to comment on the death of a relic, and claiming it might acknowledge that Atlangeriyev had remained a threat, which would contradict the narrative of Kadyrov's total control. The official Russian news agencies reported the death in a few cold, factual lines, framing it as the successful conclusion of a long manhunt for a dangerous criminal involved in terrorism and kidnapping. There were no tributes from the old guard, no public mourning from his clan. The terror he had inspired and the betrayal he had committed had isolated him even in death. His body was returned to his family for burial, a swift and quiet funeral in his ancestral village, conducted under the watchful eyes of the authorities. There was no procession of thousands, no outpouring of popular grief that sometimes attends the burial of controversial but popular figures in the region. It was a functional interment, the closing of a file. The most telling reaction, however, came from the other side. The Islamist insurgent websites and channels, notably those of the Caucasus Emirate, did claim responsibility. They hailed his death as an act of divine justice, the killing of a murtad, apostate, and a key collaborator. They released statements framing it as a successful operation of their mujahideen, a narrative that served their need for victories in a war that was grinding them down. This created a fog of competing claims. The state said it was a special op. The insurgents said it was their jihad. This very confusion is the hallmark of a perfect assassination in the North Caucasus, plausible deniability for the authority, and a propaganda token for the opposition, allowing all parties to move on without a destabilizing inquiry. The truth of who precisely pulled the trigger that day is buried under layers of espionage, clan politics, and state secrecy. It could have been FSB Alpha Group sniper, a Kadyrovtsi operative, or a jihadist sleeper cell, but the greater truth is that the order The permission and the political will for his death came from the confluence of Russian state interest and the Kadyrov regime's thirst for total dominion. He was eliminated because his continued existence served no one's purpose anymore. For Moscow, he was a spent asset and a potential loose tongue. For Grozny, he was a symbol of a rival power structure that needed erasing. For the insurgents, he was a high-value traitor. In death, as in his later life, he was a transaction. The elimination of Movladi Atlangeriyev sent a deafening message throughout the Caucasus underworld and the remnants of the resistance. The era of the independent warlord was over. The chaos that had allowed figures like him, Basayev, and even the early Kadyrovs to rise was being forcibly ordered. The new order was binary. You were with the Kadyrov regime and its Russian backers, enjoying protection and patronage but submitting completely. Or you were in the hills with the jihadists, living a short, brutal life of permanent conflict. There was no third space, no lucrative shadow state operating between the lines. The Minister of Oil and Kidnapping had been the archetype of that third space, and his corpse was proof of its extinction. His death was a keystone event in the normalization of a police state in Chechnya, a grim milestone marking the transition from hot war to a frozen, controlled peace maintained by fear. The pipelines now flowed under the guard of Kadyrov's men. The ransom business had been suppressed or taken over by the regime itself, and the kidnapping of foreigners had ceased, not out of morality, but because it was bad for the business-like image Ramzan Kadyrov sought to project to Moscow. Atlangeriyev's world was not just defeated. It was bureaucratized, its violent energies channeled into the service of the very state he had once parasitized. The legacy of Movladi Atlangeriyev is a haunting and complex one, a dark stain that seeps through the pages of recent Caucasian history, illustrating not just the life of a criminal, but the very anatomy of the post-Soviet collapse and the monstrous systems it birthed. To examine his story is to hold up a prism to a shattered time, revealing fractured beams of ambition, betrayal, survival, and the ultimate futility of power built solely on fear and greed. His rise was a direct product of a vacuum. When the iron hand of the Soviet state retracted, it left behind not freedom, but a terrifying emptiness and absence of law, economy, and social contract. In that emptiness, the strongest and most ruthless predators flourished. Atlangeriyev was not an ideologue. He was a supreme opportunist, a creature of the void. He understood before many others that in such chaos, the classic commodities of war, oil, and weapons were the only true currency, and that control over their flow was a form of sovereignty more real than any presidential decree from Grozny. He built a functional, profitable, and terrifying state within a state, a testament to the fact that in the absence of legitimate authority, criminal enterprise does not merely exist on the margins. It becomes the center. He was, in a twisted sense, perverse pioneer of privatization, taking the assets of the collapsed Soviet empire, pipelines, military hardware, even human beings, and turning them into a private portfolio. His moniker, the Minister, was the ultimate dark joke of this era, a title that perfectly captured the grotesque blurring of lines between government and mafia, between public office and private racket. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that figures like him are not mere aberrations. They are the logical, almost inevitable byproducts of systemic failure. They are the dark energy that rushes in to fill a cosmic void. Yet, his legacy is also one of profound moral corrosion. The empire he built was fundamentally extractive and parasitic. It did not build schools, hospitals, or roads except as tools for control or laundering. It thrived on the misery of others, on the hostages languishing in mountain pits, on the economies bled dry by stolen resources, on the fear that paralyzed civil society. He contributed directly to the international perception of Chechnya as a bandit republic, a label that was then used by Moscow to justify two devastating wars, and a policy of collective punishment that brutalized an entire population. His kidnapping empire, in particular, did more to isolate and demonize the Chechen cause on the world stage than any Russian propaganda ever could. By turning suffering into a business model, he and others like him poisoned the well of international sympathy and made the Chechen struggle for independence synonymous with criminal savagery in the eyes of many. In this, He was a traitor to any national aspiration far more profound than his later betrayal to the FSB. He traded the possibility of a nation's dignity for personal dominion, ensuring that the very word Chechen would evoke, for a time, the image of a masked kidnapper rather than a people seeking self-determination. Furthermore, his legacy is etched in the personal tragedies that radiated out from his actions. For every $1 million ransom paid, there was a family shattered by terror and debt. For every rival eliminated, there was a cycle of vengeance that claimed new victims. For every deal he made with corrupt officials, the institutions of any potential future state were weakened. His life was a web of cause and effect that ensnared countless innocent lives in its sticky, violent strands. The psychological landscape of a generation in Chechnya was shaped by men like him, creating a culture where violence was the primary arbiter of dispute, and where trust became the rarest and most dangerous commodity. His eventual betrayal and collaboration with the FSB add another layer of tragic complexity to his legacy. It completes the arc of a man who lived by exploiting systems, only to ultimately be consumed by the largest system of all. His switch from warlord to informant was the ultimate act of pragmatism, final, desperate bid for survival in a game that was changing its rules. In doing so, he became a key instrument in the very process that crushed the last vestiges of Chechen autonomy. The intelligence he provided helped the Russian state dismantle the resistance, paving the way for the imposition of the Kadyrov regime, a rule that would be characterized by its own brutal form of control, human rights abuses, and a cult of personality. In a bitter irony, the man who once defied Moscow became a crucial tool in Moscow's project of subjugation. His collaboration underscores a central, tragic theme of the Chechen Wars, how the resistance, fractured by internal rivalries, criminality, and ideology, often contributed to its own destruction from within. Atlangeriev's life and death also serve as a grim lesson in the fleeting nature of power derived from fear and transaction. His empire, for all its seeming solidity, had no foundation in law, loyalty, or ideology. It was a castle built on quicksand, held together by force and money. When a greater force appeared, the resolute might of the Russian state under Putin, and when the money flows were disrupted or co-opted by a new patron like Kadyrov, the castle dissolved. His loyalists were bought, threatened, or killed. His wealth was seized or rendered inaccessible. His protection was withdrawn. He discovered that the fear he inspired was a currency that could not be saved. For a rainy day, it was only valid as long as he was present to enforce it. His final years as a hunted fugitive are the ultimate testament to this truth. The mighty are only mighty as long as others believe them to be, and once that belief evaporates, they are left naked and alone. In the end, Movladi Atlangeriev's story is a cautionary tale of our modern world. It shows how easily order can disintegrate into profitable chaos, how quickly the entrepreneur of violence can become its most sought-after commodity, and how the pursuit of power in its most raw and selfish form ultimately leads to a solitary and ignoble end. He is a figure who commands a certain grim fascination for his audacity, his shrewdness, his defiance, but not an ounce of admiration or sympathy. He's a mirror reflecting a dark chapter, a human embodiment of the principle that when the lights go out, the monsters we see are not supernatural but terrifyingly, banally human, shaped by and shaping the darkness that surrounds them. To truly comprehend the ecosystem that produced and was, in turn, shaped by Movladi Atlangeriyev, we must delve deeper into the very machinery of his operations, the day-to-day reality of his rule, which was a blend of medieval fiefdom and modern corporate crime. His power was not an abstract concept. It was felt in the trembling hands of a pipeline technician paid to look the other way, in the hushed conversation of village elders forced to grant him sanctuary, in the cold dread of a businessman in Moscow receiving a call about a kidnapped relative. The oil smuggling operation alone was a vast, illicit enterprise that functioned with a disturbing efficiency. It mimicked a legitimate oil company, but with violence as its corporate law. At the top was Atlangeriyev, the CEO. Below him were layers of management, field operators who supervised the illegal taps on the pipeline, often former petroleum engineers or military sappers who understood the infrastructure. These taps were not mere hacksaws on a pipe. They were sophisticated bypasses that could divert thousands of tons of crude without triggering immediate alarms in distant control rooms. The stolen crude would be transported by a fleet of trucks, often disguised with false logos or operating under the cover of night, to hidden refineries. These refineries, known as samovars, were primitive, dangerous, and highly polluting installations set up in remote gorges. Here, the crude would be poorly processed into low-grade gasoline, diesel, and mazout, heavy fuel oil. The environmental devastation was catastrophic, with chemical runoff poisoning river and soil, but in an economy of survival. Such concerns were a ludicrous luxury. The final product was then sold through a network of distributors across the North Caucasus and into Russia proper, undercutting legitimate petrol stations and funneling profits back up the chain. This entire process required corruption at every level of the official Russian state. Border guards, police, railway officials, and even regional administrators were all on the payroll, their silence purchased with cash, threats, or a share of the product. This created a perverse symbiosis, where the Russian state apparatus was both hunting Atlangeriyev and, through its corrupt elements, being bled by him. His kidnapping ring operated with a similar corporate structure. It had a reconnaissance division that identified and profiled potential targets foreigners were prized for their government's willingness to pay. But wealthy Russian entrepreneurs were also lucrative. A logistics team handled the actual abduction, using stolen cars, fake police checkpoints, or simply brute force. A negotiation unit, often composed of men with calm, persuasive voices and a chilling grasp of psychology, would handle the ransom talks, sometimes lasting months, manipulating families and governments with a mix of false promises and graphic threats. The prisoners were held in a network of secure facilities, often basements at rural homes or isolated farm buildings, guarded by low-level foot soldiers. The finances were handled by money launderers who moved the ransom payments through a maze of shell company, offshore accounts, and hawala systems, eventually converting them into usable assets, more weapons, real estate, or luxury goods. This vertical integration of crime meant that Atlangeriyev was not just a thug, he was the head of a multinational illicit conglomerate. His authority was enforced by a private army that was well armed, mobile, and fiercely loyal, as their prosperity was directly tied to his. He paid better than the phantom Chechens did. He offered a clearer chain of command than the fractious resistance factions. His men were known for their discipline. Within his code, arbitrary violence against the local population without his approval was often punished, as it drew unwanted heat and disrupted the business environment. He cultivated an image of a stern but fair patriarch. There are stories, likely embellished but indicative of his cultivated persona, of him settling local disputes, providing gifts at weddings, and offering protection to villages that cooperated with him. This duality was key to his local legitimacy. In a land with no functioning courts or social services, he became the law and the welfare state for those under his sway. A farmer whose son was arrested by some rival gang could appeal to the minister for intervention. A family that needed money for a medical treatment might receive it, with the unspoken understanding of future loyalty. This created a toxic form of dependency, binding people to him not just through fear, but through a warped sense of gratitude and obligation. It was a classic mafia model, transplanted onto the extreme terrain of a war zone. His relationships with other power players were a constant dance of alliance and betrayal. With President Aslan Maskadov, it was a relationship of mutual contempt and mutual need. Maskadov needed Atlangeriyev's resources to fund what little state function existed, while Atlangeriyev needed the faint veneer of official legitimacy that Maskadov's title provided. And more practically, he needed the president to keep the Islamist factions in check. With the jihadists like Basayev, the relationship was one of cold hostility. They represented an ideological threat to his secular, profit-driven empire. Clashes between their forces were not uncommon, though they were often kept quiet to avoid the appearance of a civil war within the resistance. With the Russians before his defection, it was a relationship of pure predator symbiosis. He corrupted their officials, stole their oil, and killed their soldiers, while they provided, through their very infrastructure and the chaos of their war, the perfect environment for his business to thrive. This entire ecosystem existed in a state of perpetual, violent flux. Deals were made over vodka in underground bunkers one night and broken with a burst of gunfire at dawn the next morning. Alliances shifted with the wind, and trust was measured in hours, not years. Atlangeriev's genius was his ability to navigate this ever-shifting labyrinth, to read the subtle change in the balance of power, and to always ensure that he was the indispensable node in every transaction. He was the ultimate middleman in a marketplace of death, the one man who could guarantee the passage of oil from a Russian pipeline to a black market buyer, or the transfer of a hostage from a mountain cell to freedom for a price. This was the daily reality of his reign, a relentless, exhausting, and paranoid exercise in management, where the product was contraband and human suffering, and the profit was power. It was a kingdom of sludge and blood, and for a time, he was its unchallenged monarch. The human cost of Movladi Atlangeriev's empire is a ledger written in suffering, a vast and silent testament to the collateral damage of a life devoted to the accumulation of power through terror. To view his story solely through the lens of his cunning or his downfall is to ignore the thousands of lives irreparably scarred by his decisions, the families shattered, and the futures extinguished in service of his ambition. Each barrel of stolen oil represented not just lost revenue for the Russian state, but degraded environmental conditions for Chechen villagers, poisoned water sources, and a landscape further brutalized. Each successful kidnapping sent psychic shockwaves far beyond the immediate victim. Consider the aid workers, those who had come to a war-ravaged land driven by humanitarian impulse, only to find themselves chained in dark, damp pits, their lives reduced to a monetary figure in a negotiation between gangsters. Their captivity was an eternity of fear, uncertainty, and physical degradation, trauma that would linger for decades if they were fortunate enough to survive. Their families abroad were plunged into nightmares of their own, navigating the opaque and terrifying world of ransom negotiations, dealing with governments that often had no-go policies, facing impossible moral and financial dilemmas, and living with the constant, gnawing dread of receiving a grisly package in the mail. For every high-profile case that made the news, there were countless others, local businessmen, teachers, even minor officials who were snatched, their fates never reported internationally, their family drained of every ruble and ounce of hope in silent desperation. The psychological warfare employed by Atlangeriev's negotiators was a refined cruelty. They would alternate between calm reason and sudden, graphic threats. They would force hostages to plead for their lives on tape, playing on the emotions of their loved ones. They would offer false hope of imminent release, only to vanish for weeks, stretching the agony to its breaking point. This was not just business. It was a form of psychological torture inflicted upon everyone connected to the victim, designed to break the will to resist and ensure payment. Beyond the direct victims of kidnappings, there was the wider population of Chechnya, living under the dual yoke of war and criminal dominion. While Atlangeriev may have played the patron in certain instances, his overarching system was one of predation. His control over key resources meant that ordinary Chechens paid inflated prices for fuel that was, in fact, stolen from beneath their own land. His private army's presence, while sometimes a deterrent to rivals, was a constant reminder of the law of the gun. Young men were drawn into his orbit not by ideology, but by the bleak economic calculus that serving the minister offered a better chance of survival and prosperity than any other path in a shattered economy. Many of these young men would later be killed in intergang clashes, in battles with Russian forces, or purged by the Kadyrov regime, their lives cut short as expendable pawns in a game they never truly understood. The culture of impunity he embodied eroded the very fabric of society. When the most powerful man is a kidnapper and smuggler, the concept of justice, rule of law, and honest labor become meaningless jokes. It created a generation for whom criminality was normalized, where success was measured in Mercedes cars and gold watches acquired through violence, not in education or community building. This moral vacuum, partly of his making, would later be filled by the harsh, alternative order of the Islamists on one side and the equally brutal, state-sanctioned violence of the Kadyrovtsi on the other. Atlangeriev's betrayal and collaboration inflicted a different kind of wound, one of deep, communal shame and paranoia. His defection to the FSB was not just a personal act. It validated the worst Russian stereotype about Chechens, that they were fundamentally corruptible, driven by greed over principle. For the resistance, it was a demoralizing body blow. It meant that their most intimate secrets, their hiding places, their supply lines were now in the hands of the enemy, delivered by one of their own. This betrayal led directly to the deaths of fighters, the capture of commanders, and the collapse of safe network. It bred a corrosive, all-consuming suspicion within the resistance itself. After his defection, no one could be fully trusted. Was a failed operation due to bad luck or a new informant? Was a comrade's reluctance to share information a sign of prudence or guilt? This atmosphere of mistrust crippled coordination and made the insurgents even more vulnerable. For the average Chechen caught between the insurgents and the Russian forces, the knowledge that a figure like Atlangeriyev was now working for the FSB deepened the sense of despair and entrapment. It signaled that even the most powerful of their own could be bought or broken, that there was no sanctuary, no loyalty that could withstand the pressure of the state. His later hunt and death also had its own collateral damage. The villages suspected of harboring him were subjected to brutal zachistki, cleansing operations, by Kadyrov's forces or the Russian military. Homes were raided, men were detained and tortured, families were terrorized. His final flight was a trail of fear left in its wake, as anyone who had offered him a meal or a night's shelter became a potential target for reprisal. In this way, the shadow of his existence lengthened long after his power had faded, bringing danger to anyone remotely connected to him. The story of Movladi Atlangeriyev, therefore, cannot be confined to the biography of one man. It is a story with a vast, unseen chorus of victims. It is the story of the Italian electrician held for months, of the Russian businesswoman's family selling their apartment to pay a ransom, of the Chechen farmer whose land was poisoned by a sum of a refinery, of the young fighter whose location was betrayed in an FSB interrogation room based on Atlangeriyev's information, and of the entire population of a republic whose destiny was twisted, in part, by the lucrative anarchy that men like him thrived upon. His legacy is not just in the ruins of his empire, but in the silent, enduring trauma etched into countless individual lives, a reminder that the true cost of such a life of crime is never paid by the criminal alone, but is distributed as a heavy, invisible tax upon the innocent and the forgotten. The geopolitical chessboard on which Movladi Atlangeriyev operated extended far beyond the rugged mountains of Chechnya, and to fully grasp the scale of his enterprise, one must follow the tentacles of his network across borders, into the corridors of power in Moscow, and even onto the international stage. His was not a local mafia. It was a transnational criminal corporation that interfaced with state actors, foreign intelligence services, and global black markets. The oil stolen from Russian pipelines did not simply fuel local cars, it entered a complex shadow economy that reached into Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and beyond. The routes were ancient smuggling paths modernized for a new commodity. Trucks would cross the porous borders of the newly independent South Caucasus state with falsified documents or with the complicity of border guards on both sides. From there, the fuel could be blended with legitimate products shipped across the Black Sea or sold to regional distributors who asked no questions. This international dimension required partnerships. Atlangeriyev would have dealt with Georgian paramilitary leaders in the lawless Pankisi Gorge, with Azerbaijani oligarchs connected to the ruling family, and with Turkish businessmen whose networks stretched from Istanbul to the Caspian. These relationships were purely transactional, built on mutual profit and the understanding that their respected governments either turned a blind eye or were deeply compromised. The kidnapping of foreign nationals was, by its nature, an international act. It drew in foreign governments, intelligence agencies like Britain's MI6 or the American CIA, and private security firms specializing in hostage negotiation. Each high-profile kidnapping became a mini-international crisis, with diplomats engaging in back-channel talks, ransom payments potentially being facilitated through third countries, and intelligence being shared or withheld between agencies. Atlangeriyev, therefore, was not just a local problem for Moscow. He was a persistent irritant in Russia's foreign relations and embarrassment that proved the Kremlin could not control its own territory, and that its restive region was a danger to foreign citizens. This gave him a perverse form of leverage. The more foreigners he kidnapped, the more the international community pressured Moscow to resolve the situation, which sometimes led to covert negotiations or tacit permissions for ransom payments just to make the problem go away. Within Russia itself, his connections reached into the highest echelon of the power vertical, or at least into its shadowy, corrupt underbelly. To move millions of dollars worth of stolen oil across multiple Russian regions required the systematic corruption of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Federal Security Service's border and economic divisions, and the state-controlled pipeline monopoly Transneft. This was not a matter of bribing a lone traffic cop. It was a sophisticated, ongoing enterprise that implicated mid-level and possibly senior officials who saw the chaos in Chechnya as a personal profit center. There are unverified but persistent reports that Atlangeriyev had protectors within the Russian military and intelligence structures, officers who benefited from his operations and who, in turn, provided him with information, protected his shipments, or warned him of impending raids. This created a bizarre situation where one arm of the Russian state was fighting a war to eliminate separatists, while another arm was financially entwined with the very criminals funding that separation. This duality explains, in part, why he was so hard to capture for so long. He was shielded by a layer of Russian corruption. His relationship with the Chechen diaspora was also significant. Wealthy Chechens living in Europe, the Middle East, and Turkey were often approached for ransom payments, or were strong-armed into investing in his schemes. Some, out of fear or a twisted sense of patriotic duty to a powerful figure from the homeland, complied. Others became targets themselves. The diaspora was both a source of funds and a potential safe haven, and Atlangeriyev's operatives were active in these communities, a fact that extended his reach into the heart of European cities. The influx of dirty money from his operations also had a destabilizing effect on the fragile economy of the South Caucasus, fueling inflation in local markets and distorting legitimate business. Perhaps the most profound geopolitical impact of Atlangeriyev's activities, however, was the narrative they crafted. For the Kremlin, the lawless reign of men like him was the perfect propaganda tool to discredit the entire Chechen independence movement. Every kidnapped foreigner, every report of oil smuggling was used in Moscow's media to portray Chechnya not as a nation seeking freedom, but as a savage, criminal entity that needed to be subdued by a strong central state. Vladimir Putin's rise was built in part on this very narrative that promised to restore order and rub out the bandits in the outhouse. In this sense, Atlangeriyev's criminal success played directly into the hands of the Russian state's strategic goal of recentralization. He provided the justification for the Second Chechen War and the subsequent dismantling of Chechen autonomy. His actions helped transform the conflict from a war of national liberation in the eyes of the world into a counter-terrorism operation against gangsters and religious fanatics. This shift in perception was catastrophic for the Chechen cause, leading to a loss of international sympathy and allowing Western governments to tacitly accept Russia's brutal methods. Furthermore, his eventual collaboration with the FSB was a key element in the Kremlin's Chechenization policy. By turning a major warlord, Moscow demonstrated its power to co-opt and divide its enemies, encouraging others to follow suit. It showed that even the most hardened fighters had a price, and that collaboration was the only path to survival. This strategy was brutally effective in breaking the back of the secular national resistance, clearing the field for the confrontation between the Russian state and the Islamist radicals, and ultimately paving the way for the installation of the Kadyrov dynasty, which would owe its existence entirely to Moscow. Thus, Movladi Atlangeriyev was more than a gangster. He was a geopolitical actor of significant, if destructive, consequence. His criminal enterprise shaped foreign policy, fueled corruption at the heart of the Russian state, provided casus belli for war, and altered the destiny of millions. He operated in the intersection where failed states, global crime, and great power politics meet, proving that in the modern world, a man with a private army, control of a natural resource, and a total absence of scruples can, for a time, force empires to reckon with him. His story is a stark lesson in how non-state actors can exploit the seam between nations to build terrifying personal kingdoms, and how the very kingdoms can ultimately be consumed by the larger states they sought to manipulate, leaving behind a legacy of chaos and a blueprint for new forms of authoritarian control. To reduce Movladi Atlangeriev's story to a mere chronicle of crime and punishment is to miss the profound psychological portrait it paints, a study of a mind shaped by, and ultimately devoured by, a world of absolute moral relativism. Understanding the inner landscape of the minister requires venturing into the mentality of a warlord, where traditional notions of good and evil are replaced by the cold calculus of survival, loyalty, and power. His psyche was forged in the dual crucibles of Soviet oppression and Caucasian clan, a contradictory mix that produced a uniquely ruthless pragmatist. From the Soviet system, he absorbed the lessons of hierarchy, the utility of corruption, and the understanding that the state is not a sacred entity but a mechanism to be gamed. The ideological fervor of communism meant nothing to him. What he learned was that beneath the surface of official dogma, a shadow economy of connections and bribes was the real engine of life. This equipped him perfectly for the post-Soviet collapse, where the shadow became the only reality. From his Chechen Ingush heritage, he took the bedrock values of Nokchala, absolute loyalty to one's tape clan, personal dignity, courage, and a fierce, unforgiving commitment to vengeance. However, he seems to have divorced these values from their moral and communal context, weaponizing them for personal ambition. Loyalty became not to the nation or a moral code, but to himself and his immediate circle. Courage manifested as brutality, and vengeance was a tool for business elimination, not justice. This created a man who could, without apparent cognitive dissonance, provide for a poor family in his ancestral village one day, and order the torture of a kidnapped engineer the next. In his mind, these were not contradictory acts. The first solidified his base of support, a necessary investment in security, while the second was a business transaction, a means to a financial end. His worldview was fundamentally transactional. Human beings were assets or liabilities. Relationships were alliances of convenience. Even his betrayal of the resistance can be viewed through this lens. When the cost of defiance, annihilation by Russia, overwhelmingly exceeded the benefits, a dwindling, ideologically hostile power base, he made the rational business decision to switch sides. The profound guilt or moral anguish that might cripple another seems to have been absent, or at least ruthlessly suppressed. This points to a chilling degree of emotional compartmentalization, an ability to wall off the human consequences of his actions and focus solely on the strategic outcome. His leadership style was likely a blend of charismatic authority and terror. He would have commanded respect not through bombastic speeches, but through a demeanor of calm, unshakable certainty, through a reputation for keeping his word in deals, and through the demonstrated swift ferocity of his retribution. His charisma was not one of warmth, but of formidable competence and control. In the chaos around him, he presented himself as an island of grim order. For young men adrift in a shattered society, this was a powerful lure, the chance to be part of something potent and clear-cut, where the rules, though brutal, were at least known and consistently enforced by a strong leader. This psychological contract, absolute loyalty in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils, is the glue of all mafia structures, and he perfected it. Yet, beneath this facade of control, the pressures must have been immense. The constant state of war, the need to manage volatile alliances, the ever-present threat of assassination, and the knowledge that he was hated by millions would have required a monumental capacity for stress. He likely existed in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, his nervous system permanently tuned to threat. Sleep would have been elusive, trust a luxury. This state, maintained over years, corrodes the soul. It breeds paranoia, which in turn fuels preemptive violence, creating a vicious cycle. Reports from those who knew him suggest he was not a drunkard or a drug user, common crutch for men in such professions. Instead, he exercised formidable self-discipline. This discipline was his armor, but it also meant he had no release valve for the psychological pressure, internalizing all the horror and tension. His relationship with religion is particularly telling. He was born a Muslim in a deeply Muslim region, yet his life was a systematic violation of Islamic law. There is no record of him being a religious observer. Unlike the jihadists he opposed, he did not cloak his actions in religious rhetoric. His power was secular, based on force and economics. This places him in the tradition of the Soviet-era Abrek who defies all gods and masters, but also separates him from the growing wave of Islamist militancy that would eventually condemn him. It suggests a fundamentally materialist worldview. This life, its power and its profits, was all that mattered. The afterlife, if it existed, was a problem for later. This made him an enemy to the devout on all sides, to the Sufi traditionalists, to the Wahhabi jihadists, and to the Orthodox Russian state. He was a man of his time, a product of a godless Soviet upbringing, thrust into a region where God was becoming a central battlefield. His ultimate psychological undoing began not with his physical hunt, but with his defection. The moment he shook hands with the FSB, he severed the last thread connecting him to a coherent identity. He was no longer a Chechen fighter, even a rogue one. He was now a tool of the very state he had fought and parasitized. This required a profound psychological rupture. He had to reframe his entire life's narrative. His past actions were no longer those of a sovereign actor, but of a misguided criminal now seeing the light. Or more cynically, of a pragmatist cutting his losses. This internal narrative, necessary for survival, is a form of self-betrayal that can be more damaging than any external threat. It likely created a profound inner emptiness. A hollow man where once a formidable will had resided. The final years of flight completed this psychological dissolution. The master of networks became a disconnected atom. The architect of systems was reduced to pure animal instinct: find food, find shelter, avoid danger. The towering ego that demanded the title minister was forced into the ultimate humility of dependency on a shrinking circle of helpers. This gradual stripping away of every pillar of his identity, power, wealth, status, loyalty, even agency, was a psychological death that preceded the physical one. In the end, the man who died in Nazran was likely a ghost of the man who once ruled the shadows. The fearsome will had been eroded by paranoia, the strategic mind dulled by survival fatigue, the arrogant pride shattered by the humiliation of being a hunted rabbit in his own land. His story is thus a tragic psychological arc, from the formation of a formidable, amoral will in a world of chaos, to the peak of its terrifying expression, and finally to its slow, grinding disintegration under the weight of its own contradictions and the relentless pressure of the forces it helped unleash. He is a testament to the fact that a life built on the subjugation of others ultimately subjugates the self, trapping the tyrant in a prison of his own making, a prison whose walls are made of fear, and whose only exit is a bullet, whose arrival he spends his final years simultaneously dreading and, perhaps in his darkest moments, welcoming as a release. The shadow of Movladi Atlangeriyev did not vanish with his death. Instead, it fragmented and seeped into the very foundations of the new Chechen reality, shaping the method, the economy, and the brutal ethos of the regime that succeeded him. His elimination was a necessary precondition for the establishment of Ramzan Kadyrov's absolute authority, but in a grotesque twist, Kadyrov's Chechnya would institutionalize and weaponize many of the same criminal practices that Atlangeriyev had pioneered, albeit under the banner of the state and with the full backing of Moscow. The transition from the chaotic, multipolar criminality of the 1990s to the centralized, state-sanctioned criminality of the 2000s is a key, often overlooked, chapter in the story. Kadyrov did not defeat the warlord model, he absorbed and bureaucratized it. Consider the oil business, the chaotic sum of refineries and freelance pipeline taps that characterized Atlangeriyev era were systematically destroyed, not to end the theft of oil, but to monopolize it. Control over Chechnya energy flows was consolidated under the state-owned Chechen FSB and, more importantly, under the private holdings and intermediaries loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov. The smuggling continued, but it became a state enterprise. The complex logistics, the corrupt officials, the cross-border networks all were streamlined and brought under a single, unchallengeable command, where Atlangeriyev paid bribes to Russian officials. Kadyrov's regime now enjoyed official partnership with Russian state energy giants like Rosneft, with lucrative kickbacks and shadowy side deals replacing the risky black market transactions. The revenue no longer funded a private army competing with the state. It funded the state's own private army, the Kadyrovtsi, and the grandiose construction projects in Grozny that were designed to showcase loyalty to Moscow. and legitimize Kadyrov's rule. In essence, Atlangeriyev's business model was nationalized. The same applies to the economy of violence, kidnapping for ransom. Atlangeriyev's other signature enterprise was also suppressed, but it was replaced by a more insidious and systematic form of human rights abuse: enforced disappearances. Instead of kidnapping for money, the Kadyrov regime disappeared people for politics, suspected insurgents, their relatives, critics, and anyone deemed disloyal. The techniques of abduction, secret imprisonment, and torture were refined and scaled up, now conducted not from mountain hideouts, but from official government buildings and secret prisons owned by the security apparatus. The ransom demand was replaced by a forced confession, or simply a silent execution. The terror became more pervasive and predictable, administered by the state rather than by competing gangs. In this sense, Kadyrov perfected what Atlangeriev had commercialized: the use of terror as a tool of control, stripping it of its profit motive for individual actors and making it a pure instrument of state policy. Even Atlangeriev's method of governance, the blend of patronage and fear, became the blueprint for Kadyrov's rule. Kadyrov positioned himself as the ultimate patron, distributing cash, cars, and apartments to loyalists, funding weddings, and presenting himself as the father of the nation. This was Atlangeriev's village-level paternalism writ large, amplified by billions of federal rubles from Moscow. Conversely, the fear he inspired was magnitudes greater and more systematic. The impunity enjoyed by Atlangeriev's men was transferred to the Kadyrovtsi, who operated with a license to kill, torture, and extort with zero legal consequences. The difference was that this impunity was now officially sanctioned the warlord. His men had become the official police and military units of the Republic. The chaos that allowed an Atlangeriev to rise was replaced by a chilling, uniform order where all violence flowed from a single source. Furthermore, the fate of Atlangeriev served as the ultimate object lesson for any other potential power centers. His journey from untouchable minister to hunted informant to corpse in a Nazarene yard was a public demonstration, understood by every former fighter, businessman, or clan leader, of the futility of independence. The message was clear: you could be a formidable warlord, you could even be useful to Moscow for a time, but ultimately you would either submit completely to the new authority in Grozny, or you would be annihilated. There was no third path. This lesson effectively broke the back of any potential secular, nationalist opposition that wasn't already destroyed by the war. It cleared the field, ensuring that the only remaining resistance was the marginalized, hardline Islamist underground, which Kadyrov could then fight with Moscow's full support, further solidifying his own indispensability. In a macabre way, Atlangeriev's legacy also lives on in the personal history of Ramzan Kadyrov himself. Kadyrov's father, Ahmad, the first Moscow-backed leader, was a former mufti who had initially supported the separatists. The Kadyrovs understood the world of shifting alliances and brutal pragmatism because they had navigated it themselves. They watched figures like Atlangeriev and learned. They saw that pure criminality was unsustainable, but that criminal methods, when fused with political power and ideological cover, could be the foundation of a durable authoritarian state. The Kadyrov regime is, in many ways, the evolutionary successor to the Atlangeriev model, a hybrid mafia state that has successfully presented itself to the Kremlin as the only viable manager of a violent, resource-rich region. It learned from Atlangeriev's mistakes, his failure to secure a lasting political legitimization, his alienation of the Islamists, his ultimate dependence on fickle Russian masters, and built a system that addressed all these flaws. Thus, to walk the streets of a rebuilt Grozny today, with its glittering mosques and towering skyscraper named after Vladimir Putin, is to walk atop the grave of Movladi Atlangeriev's world. The order, the silence, the pervasive fear, and the grotesque displays of loyalty are all monuments to his defeat, but also to the perverse victory of his methods. The anarchy he embodied was not cured. It was captured, tamed, and put in a uniform. His story, therefore, is not an epilogue but a prologue. It is the story of the brutal kindergarten in which the modern Chechen state was forged, a lesson in how the most destructive forces of chaos can be harnessed and redirected to build a prison of perfect, terrible order. The minister is gone, but but the ministry he inadvertently helped create endures, a lasting testament to the fact that sometimes, when you kill a monster, you don't end the nightmare, you simply appoint a new, more efficient monster to run it. The tale of Movladi Atlangeriyev reverberates far beyond the specific geography of the North Caucasus, serving as a dark archetype, a case study in the life cycle of the modern warlord. In an era of crumbling states and globalized shadow economies, his story provides a grim template against which other figures, from the drug lords of Mexico to the militia leaders of Libya and the oligarchs of post-Soviet states, can be understood. It illustrates the universal conditions that breed such figures: the sudden collapse of a centralized authority, the existence of a valuable, lootable resource, be it oil, drugs, or diamonds, and the presence of a marginalized, martial population with a tradition of defiance. Atlangeriyev's career is a masterclass in the stages of this life cycle. First, the emergence from the chaos as an organizer, someone who imposes a brutal order where none exists, often leveraging military experience and clan networks. Then, the consolidation of power through control of the resource, which funds a private army and corrupts the remnants of the state. This is followed by the quasi-statehood phase, where the warlord provides basic services and security to a population in exchange for loyalty and cover, effectively becoming a parallel government. His moniker, the Minister, perfectly encapsulates this phase of formalizing criminal power into a shadow governance structure. The next stage is the challenge from systemic forces, where the warlord's independent power inevitably clashes with a resurgent central state or a rival ideological movement. This leads to the critical choice: fight to the death, flee, or collaborate. Atlangeriyev chose collaboration, entering the diminishment phase, where he becomes a tool of a greater power, trading his autonomy for survival, his value depreciating with each piece of intelligence given. Finally comes the liquidation, where the asset is disposed of once his utility is outweighed by his liability, often by the very patron who once protected him, or by the enemies he made along the way. This life cycle is not unique to Chechnya. It is a recurring script in the bloody theater of state failure. Consider the similarities with Pablo Escobar in Colombia. Both men emerged from periods of national violence and weak state control. Both built empires on illicit commodity cocaine for Escobar, stolen oil for Atlangeriyev. Both established quasi-states, with Escobar building neighborhoods and sponsoring football teams, while Atlangeriyev settled local disputes and acted as a patron. Both were challenged by the state, chose violent confrontation, and were ultimately killed in dramatic operation. The key difference lies in the geopolitical context. Escobar operated in a sovereign state with a tenuous but existing democracy appealing to the us for help, while Atlangeriyev operated in a secessionist territory during a hot war, navigating the complex patronage of the Russian state. Another parallel can be drawn with a figure like General Khalifa Haftar in Libya, a former CIA asset who returned to build a personal army controlling Libya, Oil Crescent, using the resource to fund his ambitions and position himself as an indispensable, if chaotic, power broker amidst state collapse. Atlangeriyev's story also sheds light on the nature of the post-Soviet violent entrepreneur. Across the former Soviet Union, from Tajikistan to Ukraine, the 1990s saw the rise of similar figures who filled the vacuum left by the retreating state with private violence and protection rackets. Some, like the Russian oligarchs who plundered natural resources, transitioned into legitimate business and politics. Others, like Atlangeriyev, who operated in a zone of active rebellion, remained in the violent, non-state realm until they were crushed or absorbed. His experience highlights the specific Chechen twist on this model, the fusion of criminal entrepreneurship with the structures and rhetoric of national resistance, which created a uniquely toxic and resilient form of warlordism. Furthermore, his fate is a textbook example of the useful idiot in geopolitics. He was used by all sides, by the Chechen resistance as a financier and enforcer when it suited them, by the Russian security service as an intelligence mine, and by the Kadyrov project as a symbolic enemy whose destruction demonstrated the new regime's power. He believed he was playing the game, but in the end, he was a game piece on a board controlled by others. This is the ultimate lesson for any non-state actor who achieves significant power without a legitimizing ideology that can mobilize masses beyond fear and greed. or without transforming into a recognized political entity. They remain vulnerable to being co-opted and discarded by state actors who hold the ultimate tools of legitimacy and large-scale violence. Atlangeriev's story also serves as a warning about the long-term societal costs of such figures. The criminalization of the economy and politics that he helped engineer did not end with him. It created a culture where violence and corruption were the primary means of problem-solving, a culture that the subsequent Kadyrov regime did not dismantle but rather formalized. This has lasting generational effects, shaping a society's expectations of leadership and justice for decades. It normalizes brutality and erodes the very concept of the public good, replacing it with a logic of patronage and predation. For the international community, the Atlangeriyev case study underscores the dangerous interplay between crime and conflict. In modern civil wars, the lines between political rebellion and criminal enterprise are increasingly blurred. Insurgents fund themselves through crime, and criminals adopt the rhetoric of rebellion for protection and legitimacy. This makes conflicts more intractable, as economic incentives to continue fighting outweigh political ones. It also complicates peacemaking, as demobilizing fighter means dismantling lucrative criminal syndicates, a task often beyond the will or capacity of peace builders. In conclusion, Movladi Atlangeriyev was a man of his specific time and place, but the blueprint of his rise and fall is disturbingly portable. He is a mirror reflecting the dark potential that lurks in the heart of state failure. His life answers the question of what happens when the monopoly of violence breaks down, and his death answers the question of what happens when that monopoly is brutally reclaimed. He is a historical footnote with global echoes, a reminder that in the shadow, between nations and laws, empires of blood and money can still be built, but they are always inevitably temporary, destined to be washed away by the tide of greater forces, or consumed by the very chaos that gave them birth. To study him is not to study a unique monster, but to study a type, a recurring character in the tragic play of human history whenever the stage is set by collapse, resource, and ambition. To dissect the operational anatomy of Movladi Atlangeriyev's downfall is to move beyond the broad geopolitical currents and in the granular human decisions and betrayals that form the fatal cracks in any empire of fear. His end was not a singular event, but a cascade of failures, miscalculations, and eroded assets, a systematic unraveling that offers a master class in the vulnerabilities inherent to a life built on criminal sovereignty. The first and most profound vulnerability was the inherent instability of his power base. Unlike a state, which derives legitimacy from tradition, law, or ideology, Atlangeriyev's authority was purely functional and personal. People followed him because he delivered results, money, protection, a semblance of order, and because they feared his retribution. This is a fragile foundation. When he could no longer deliver, when the Russian war machine began crushing his smuggling routes and the kidnapping business drew too much heat, the pragmatic loyalty of his subordinates began to waver. The financial engine of his empire was under relentless assault. The Second Chechen War brought not just troops, but a more sophisticated Russian approach to economic warfare. Special forces and airstrikes targeted the Samova refineries. The FSB and GRU intensified their penetration of the corruption networks that allowed his oil to flow, arresting or turning key intermediaries on the Russian side. The revenue streams began to dry up, and with them, his ability to pay his fighters and bribe officials. An unpaid soldier is a potential traitor. A bribed official who stops receiving payments is a potential informant. His economic model, dependent on a certain level of chaotic stability, could not survive a total war of annihilation. The second crack was the ideological shift within Chechnya itself. The rise of Salafi jihadism, embodied by Basayev and Khattab, created a powerful counterforce to his secular, clan-based criminal authority. This was not just a rival gang, it was a rival moral universe that condemned his entire operation as haram and un-Islamic. This ideological challenge polarized the resistance and the population. It forced people to choose not just between profit and loss, but between two conflicting visions of the future. For many young, devout Chechens radicalized by war and Russian brutality, Atlangeriyev represented the corrupt, greedy old guard that had failed the nation. His power to inspire loyalty among a new generation was zero. He could only compel obedience through fear, which is always a weaker bond. This ideological alienation left him politically isolated, making his eventual deal with the Russian not just a strategic choice, but a necessity born of having nowhere else to go within his own society. The third fatal flaw was his misreading of the Russian state's resolve and method during the First War. He had thrived by manipulating a weak, demoralized, and corrupt Russian military and political establishment. He likely believed the Second War would follow a similar pattern of bloody but ultimately inconclusive conflict that would leave space for men like him to operate. He failed to comprehend the fundamental change represented by Vladimir Putin. Putin's Kremlin was not interested in messy negotiations with warlords. It was determined to achieve total military victory and impose a political solution from above, using any means necessary. Atlangeriyev underestimated the willingness of the Russian state to use overwhelming, indiscriminate force and to pursue a long-term, intelligence-driven strategy of co-option and extermination. He thought he was dealing with the same chaotic bear. He didn't realize it had been replaced by a far more disciplined and ruthless predator. His decision to collaborate, while a tactical move for survival, was also a catastrophic strategic misjudgment of his new master's long-term intention. He believed the FSB would protect him as a valued asset indefinitely. He failed to understand that in the eyes of the Russian security state, he was never a partner, only a temporary tool. His knowledge had a shelf life, and his notoriety made him a permanent liability. The fourth element of his downfall was the erosion of his human intelligence network. The very eyes and ears of his power. Counterinsurgency is, at its core, a battle for information. The FSB, with virtually unlimited resources and a willingness to use extreme torture, systematically dismantled his network. Informants were rolled up, safe houses were compromised, and communication lines were intercepted. The intimate knowledge of the terrain and population that had been his advantage was slowly matched and then surpassed by the Russians, especially as they poured money and authority into building up Akhmat and later Ramzan Kadyrov's parallel intelligence apparatus, which was staffed by Chechens who knew the clans and the land as well as he did. He was being out-intellected on his own turf. Finally, and perhaps most decisively, was the personal factor, the erosion of his own judgment under the immense, sustained pressure. The confident, calculating minister of the late 90s was by the mid-2000s a man under siege. The constant stress of being hunted, the psychological burden of betrayal, the loneliness of his gilded cage as a collaborator, and the humiliating dependency on his handlers would have degraded his decision-making abilities. Paranoia, the constant companion of the tyrant, likely became debilitating. He may have begun to see threats where there were none, distrust loyal lieutenants, and make impulsive, desperate moves. His attempt to navigate independent negotiations or his movements in his final months suggest a man trying to regain control, but his actions were likely those of a cornered animal, not a strategic mastermind. He was no longer playing chess. He was trying to escape a burning building. This degradation of personal agency is the final stage in the downfall of any autocrat. When the mind that built the system can no longer effectively command it, the system collapses in on itself. In the end, Atlangeriev's downfall was overdetermined. It was the result of converging vectors, the shifting ideological landscape, the overwhelming force of a resurgent state, the drying up of his economic lifeblood, the systematic destruction of his intelligence network, and the corrosion of his own psyche. He was not simply killed, he was dismantled. Each pillar of his power was targeted and removed, until all that remained was the man himself, alone and exposed in a Nazran courtyard. His story is a grimly instructive diagram of how modern states, particularly authoritarian ones, can neutralize even the most entrenched non-state rivals, not merely through brute force, but through a comprehensive campaign that attacks the economic, intelligence, psychological, and political foundations of their power simultaneously, leaving the hollowed-out figure to be plucked off the board when he is no longer of any use to anyone. The silence that surrounds the precise details of Movladi Atlangeriev's final operation and the competing narratives of his death are not merely gaps in a biography. They are the very essence of his legacy, the fitting culmination of a life lived in the obscuring fog of war, crime, and espionage. In the North Caucasus, truth is often the first casualty, and in his case, it was buried with him. The official Russian version, a special operation, where he opened fire and was neutralized, is a sterile formula, a bureaucratic epitaph designed to close a file without opening inquiries. The insurgent claim of responsibility is a necessary boast, a currency of morale in a grinding conflict. The reality, lying somewhere in the murky intersection of these claims, is known only to a handful of FSB case officers, Kadyrovtsi commanders, and perhaps the triggerman whose bullet found its mark. This ambiguity is itself a powerful tool. For the state, it allows for plausible deniability, avoiding the diplomatic and legal complications of openly executing a turned asset. For the insurgency, it provides a victory narrative. For the Kadyrov regime, silence avoids acknowledging a rival's significance in death. As in life, Atlangeriyev served multiple agendas, his corpse, a mute symbol upon which all parties could project their own meaning. This obscurity extends to his entire archive, the exact sum of his wealth, the full list of his victims, the specific identity of his protectors within the Russian system, the minutiae of his negotiation with the FSB. These are secrets swallowed by the vast, opaque machinery of the Russian security state and the closed, clan-based society of Chechnya. There are no public trials, no truth and reconciliation commissions, no investigative journalists with access to his ledgers. His story is pieced together from fragments, intercepted communications, the testimony of former hostages, the whispers of defectors, and the dry reports of intelligence analysts. It is a history written in shadows, which makes the full assessment of his impact and the true scale of his crimes an exercise in informed speculation. This lack of closure has profound consequences for the families of his victims. Many never received bodies or conclusive proof of fate. The ambiguity prolongs their anguish. Was their loved one killed quickly, or did they suffer for months? Was a ransom actually paid before execution? These unanswered questions are a perpetual wound. For Chechen society, the unresolved histories of figures like Atlangeriyev contribute to a collective, unprocessed trauma. The war is not discussed openly. It is a dark room in the national psyche, whose door is kept locked by official decree from Grozny and Moscow. The complex, morally ambiguous roles played by men like him, part patron, part predator, defy the simplistic heroes and terrorists narratives now imposed by the state. This stifling of history prevents a genuine societal reckoning, forcing the pain and confusion of that era inward, where it festers. Furthermore, the methods he pioneered and that were later refined by the state have left a permanent stain on governance in the region. The model of combining extreme violence with patronage, of controlling resources through a blend of corruption and fear, did not die with him. It became systematized. Young men growing up in Chechnya today may not know the name Movladi Atlangeriyev, but they live in a system whose logic he helped validate. They understand that power flows from loyalty to the ruler, that wealth is often tied to state-sanctioned graft, and that dissent is met not with legal process but with disappearance. He demonstrated, tragically, that such a system could be efficient, and his successors learned that lesson all too well. His legacy, therefore, is not a monument but a pathogen, a way of exercising power that proved survivable, and was thus absorbed into the political bloodstream of the region. On a broader scale, his story offers a cautionary tale about the limits of human intelligence in dirty wars. The FSB's cultivation and use of Atlangeriyev was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic moral disaster. While his intelligence undoubtedly saved Russian lives and helped dismantle the resistance in the short term, it also reinforced the most brutal tendencies within the Russian security apparatus. It proved that betrayal could be purchased, that the most horrific crimes could be overlooked in exchange for cooperation, and that human beings are ultimately disposable tools. This calculus dehumanizes everyone it touches, the asset, the handler, and the victims on all sides. It creates a world where there are no principles, only temporarily aligned interests, a world that Atlangeriyev himself had inhabited long before the FSB recruited him. In recruiting him, they did not defeat his world, they joined it. Finally, the silence around his end speaks to the ultimate fate of those who live by the sword in the modern era. There are no epic poems for the modern warlord, no glorious sagas. In an age of satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, and ruthless state bureaucracies, the independent actor, no matter how powerful, is eventually located, categorized, and processed. His death was not a dramatic fall in bell, but a clinical termination. His name does not live on as a rallying cry, but as a faint, cautionary footnote in intelligence briefings and historical analysis. The romantic notion of the outlaw, the abreck-defying empires, is extinguished in the bland language of counter-terrorism operation completed. This is the modern death of the bandit king, not with a myth, but with a memo. In the final analysis, Movladi Atlangeriev's life and death hold up a dark mirror to our understanding of power, crime, and the state. He shows us that the state and the criminal are not always opposites. Sometimes they are competitors, sometimes collaborators, and sometimes the state simply out-criminals the criminal, adopting his methods and surpassing his scale. His empty grave in history, filled with competing lies and unanswered questions, is his most fitting memorial. It symbolizes the void he both came from and helped to create, a void where law was absent, where truth was negotiable, and where a man could be a minister, a monster, and a martyr all at once, depending on who is telling the story and to what end. To remember him is not to remember a man, but to remember a set of conditions, a recipe for hell that, given the right mix of collapse, resource, and ambition, could be cooked up again anywhere in the world. His story is a whisper from the shadows of the 21st century, reminding us that the line between order and chaos, between government and mafia, is thinner than we dare to believe, and that it is policed not by principles but by the coldest calculus of power. To truly anchor the spectral figure of Movladi Atlangeriyev in reality, we must momentarily step away from the grand narratives of geopolitics and criminal enterprise and consider the tangible, physical world he inhabited and transformed. His domain was not an abstract concept of power, but a specific, brutalized landscape, the Chechen and Ingush countryside of the 1990s and early 2000s, a place where the very earth bore the scars of his operations and where the daily lives of ordinary people were bent to the will of his commerce. Imagine the landscape of his empire, the foothills of the Caucasus, beautiful and severe, scarred by the black, toxic wounds of the samovar refineries. These clandestine installations were not hidden in the abstract, they were physical blights. In hidden gorges near villages like Bamut or Samashki, one would find a scene of apocalyptic industry, makeshift distillation towers cobbled together from salvaged pipes and barrels, fires burning day and night under metal drums, the air thick with the acrid stench of sulfur and burning crude. The ground around them would be soaked black, a poisonous sludge killing all vegetation and seeping into groundwater. These were the factories of his wealth, places where stolen oil was turned into dirty gasoline operated by men in grimy clothes, armed with Kalashnikovs, their eyes on the tree line for Russian helicopters, the pipelines themselves. The great steel arteries of the Russian state running through Chechen land would show the physical evidence of his taps clandestine, valves welded onto the main line, covered with false rocks or buried under dirt, from which rubber hoses snaked like parasites into waiting tanker trucks. These trucks, a constant convoy of his wealth, rumbled along broken roads that were not maintained by any government, but were kept passable by his own men, as they were the commercial highways of his shadow state. The safe houses and prisons were another physical testament. They were not dungeons from fantasy, but ordinary places turned sinister. The basement of a war-damaged brick house in Urus Martan, reinforced with a steel door, a remote sheep herder. Stone Saklia in the mountains near Vedeno, its windows boarded up, a farm compound on the outskirts of Grozny, its perimeter watched by teenagers with walkie-talkies. In these unremarkable locations, hostages spent months in darkness, their world reduced to the sound of their own breathing, the scuttle of rats, and the occasional, terrifying arrival of guards with food or a video camera. The psychological geography of his realm was defined by checkpoint, but these were not official state borders. They were the arbitrary frontiers of his influence. A village entrance might be controlled by a couple of his young soldiers lounging on ammo crates, waving through familiar faces and stopping strangers for taxes or information. These checkpoints were the capillaries of his control, regulating movement, collecting intelligence, and reminding everyone that in this territory the men with the guns answered to the minister, not to any piece of paper from Grozny or Moscow. His own residences, before his fall, would have reflected his paradoxical status. Not ostentatious palaces that would draw too much attention, but substantial, heavily fortified compounds in strategic villages, high walls, CCTV cameras before they were commonplace, multiple layers of guards, and escape routes. Inside, they would have been furnished with a mix of crude masculine comfort, large tables for feasting, expensive carpets and modern communications gear, satellite phones, and weapons caches. He lived in a fortress within a fortress, a physical embodiment of the siege mentality that underpinned his power. The human texture of daily life under his influence was one of calibrated fear and forced normalcy. A shopkeeper in Argun would know that a portion of his profits from selling fuel went to Atlangeriyev as men, not as a formal tax, but as a protection payment delivered by a quiet, unsmiling visitor. A village elder in Shali might be summoned to mediate a dispute, not by a court, but by a message from one of Atlangeriyev's lieutenants requiring him to travel to a designated house and stand in the presence of the boss, who would deliver a verdict that was final and enforced by violence. Weddings and funerals in areas he controlled would see unexpected. Generous gifts arrive from him, a slaughtered cow, a sum of money, a gesture that was both a benevolent patronage and a subtle reminder of his omnipresent eye. It was a world where the rules were unwritten but brutally clear, where the economy ran on contraband and fear, and where the most powerful man was a ghost who manifested in sudden visits, in the rumble of his convoys, and in the whispered warnings of what happened to those who crossed him. This physical and social reality made his eventual implosion all the more visceral. As his power waned, the checkpoints disappeared or were taken over by rivals. The Samovar refineries were bombed into twisted metal skeletons by Russian jets. The safe houses were abandoned, their doors hanging open, leaving behind only stains and silence. The flow of gifts and patronage dried up, leaving communities that had depended on his skewed economy even more destitute. The man who was once a physical constant in the landscape of present felt in the trucks on the road, the armed men in the market. Sudden wealth of his lieutenants vanished, becoming a rumor, then a memory, then a ghost story told to warn ambitious young men. His final physical existence, as a fugitive, was the ultimate negation of this former dominion. He was reduced to moving between borrowed rooms, to seeing the landscape from the windows of anonymous cars, to fearing the very checkpoints he once controlled. The mountains that had hidden his refineries now only hid him. They no longer worked for him. The clan networks that had been his censors became his potential betrayers. The physical world he had bent to his will became a prison hunting him down. In the end, the concrete reality of his death, in a Nazran yard, a patch of gravel, a parked car, the sound of gunfire, and then stillness, was the most mundane and final truth. The legend of the minister dissolved into the forensic details of a crime scene report. A body, a weapon, a location. The vast, intimidating physical empire of oil, weapons, and fear was reduced to the few cubic feet occupied by a corpse. This is the ultimate lesson written in the landscape he once ruled, that all empires of violence, no matter how deeply they etch themselves into the earth, and the lives of people, are temporary. They leave behind poisoned soil, ruined buildings, and traumatized souls. But the mountains remain, waiting for the next chapter silently, erasing the scars, as indifferent to the minister as they were to the tsars and commissars who came before him. The enduring enigma of Movladi Atlangeriyev lies not in the unsolved mysteries of his operations, but in the unanswered philosophical questions his life poses about the nature of power, loyalty, and the human capacity for mortal navigation in a world stripped of its rules. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that evil is rarely a cartoonish monstrosity, but often a series of rational, pragmatic choices made in an environment where the very definitions of good and evil have been annihilated by war. Was he a product of his circumstances? Or did he actively shape a monstrous reality? The evidence suggests a terrifying synthesis. He was a perfect, adaptive engine for a specific ecosystem of chaos. When the ecosystem changed, when order, however brutal, was reimposed from outside, his design became obsolete and he was scrapped. This raises a disturbing question about agency in times of societal collapse. How much choice did a man like him truly have? Could he have chosen a different path when the only paths available were subservience to a crumbling state, alignment with an increasingly fanatical resistance, or the creation of his own domain? His choice to build a criminal sovereignty might be seen not as a purely malevolent act, but as the ultimate expression of a Hobbesian will to survive and dominate in a state of nature where life was truly nasty, brutish, and short. This does not excuse his actions, but it contextualizes them as a horrifyingly logical outcome of a failed world. His relationship with the concept of Chechen nationhood is another profound paradox. He operated under the banner of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, yet his action did more to undermine its legitimacy and viability than almost any Russian bomb. He drained its potential resources, corrupted its officials, and presented its face to the world as one of criminal savagery. So, was he a nationalist? It seems more accurate to say he was a hyper-localist. His loyalty was to his immediate circle, his clan, and his own power project. The nation was an abstract concept, useful as a flag to rally under or as a grievance to exploit, but not a sacred cause to die for. This highlights a fatal schism in the Chechen resistance of the 1990s, the clash between the secular nationalists like Maskarov, who dreamed of a state, and the warlord capitalists like Atlangeriyev, who profited from the absence of one. His legacy is a stark warning to independence movements everywhere. The cause can be hijacked and consumed from within by those who see the struggle not as a path to freedom, but as a cover for plunder. The most haunting question his life poses is about the nature of betrayal. His defection to the FSB is the central moral event of his later years. In the traditional Chechen code, and in most martial codes, this is the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Yet, from a purely survivalist perspective, faced with annihilation by Russia and alienation by the jihadists, it was the only move left on the board. This forces us to ask, is betrayal an absolute moral category, or is it relative to survival? Did he betray Chechnya, or did a certain idea of Chechnya betray him by becoming something he could not coexist with? His story suggests that in the moral quagmire of civil war and occupation, the concept of betrayal becomes destabilized. Everyone is betraying someone. Ideals are betrayed for power. Allies are betrayed for advantage. Populations are betrayed by their leaders. He became a master of this ambiguous world, and ultimately, he was mastered by it, betrayed by his new patrons when his utility expired. His end asks us what loyalty is worth in a universe where all loyalties are contingent. Furthermore, his psychological portrait challenges our understanding of a criminal mind. He was not a psychopath devoid of empathy. His ability to build a network based on personal loyalty and patronage suggests he understood and manipulated human bonds. He was not a madman. His operations were models of cold, strategic calculation. He seems to have possessed what the political philosopher Hannah Arendt termed the banality of evil, the capacity to commit atrocities not out of fanatical hatred, but out of a mundane commitment to a job, a system, or a personal goal. His evil was administrative. He managed kidnapping and oil theft with the same dispassionate efficiency a factory manager might show for production quotas. This is, in many ways, more frightening than the raving ideologue because it is so replicable. It shows that ordinary human traits, ambition, intelligence, pragmatism, when divorced from a moral framework, can service a machinery of horror just as effectively as any psychosis. Finally, his story is a meditation on the futility of certain kinds of power. He achieved a form of kingship in the shadows, commanding armies and wealth, his name spoken in fear. Yet what did it yield? It yielded no lasting legacy, no institution, no positive change for his people. It yielded a trail of graves and a reputation as a turncoat and a gangster. His power was entirely negative, the power to take, to destroy, to prevent. He could stop things from happening. He could extract wealth. He could instill fear, but he could not build a society, inspire genuine devotion, or create anything of enduring value. His rise proved that in chaos, a strong, ruthless will can conquer. His fall proved that such conquest is an empty victory, a castle built on sand that is swept away by the next tide. In the end, The philosophical lesson of Movladi Atlangeriyev is a grim one. He demonstrates that human beings are terrifyingly adaptable, that we can normalize almost any level of brutality if it becomes the currency of survival and success. He shows that the structures of civilization, laws, morals, social contracts are fragile veneer, and when they crack, something ancient and savage quickly bubbles to the surface. But he also shows in his lonely, hunted demise that a life lived in that savage space, no matter how powerful it seems in the moment, is ultimately a dead end. It leads not to glory or remembrance, but to a silent, contested death in a dusty yard, a subject for analysts and a warning for historians. He is a figure who looked into the abyss of a world without rules, decided to rule it, and was then consumed by the very darkness he sought to command. His life asks us what we are capable of in such circumstances, and his death answers with a chilling whisper, we are capable of anything, and that is the problem. The voice of Movladi Atlangeriyev himself is the greatest missing piece in this entire mosaic. We have the actions, the consequences, the reports of others, but his own internal monologue, his justifications, his private fears, his moments of doubt or triumph are lost to history. This silence is a void around which the entire narrative is built, force us to infer the man from the monstrous footprint he left behind. What would he have said in his own defense? If given a platform not controlled by a prosecutor or a propagandist, it is likely his testimony would have been a masterclass in the moral logic of the warlord, a chillingly coherent worldview forged in the furnace of late Soviet decay and Chechen martyrdom. He might have begun not with apology, but with grievance. He would have spoken of the indignities of the Soviet system, of the hypocrisy of Moscow's rule, of the brutal collective punishment inflicted on his people. He would have framed his early criminal activities not as greed, but as a form of resistance, hitting the Soviet and later Russian state where it hurt in its economy. The oil, he was merely reclaiming what Moscow had stolen from Chechen land for decades. The weapons smuggling, arming a nation fighting for its very existence against a genocidal foe. In this telling, he was not a gangster, but a resourceful quartermaster for a cause. The kidnappings would be the hardest to justify, but even here, a warped logic exists. In the absence of a formal state treasury, in a war against a vastly richer enemy, was not the taking of hostages, demanding tribute a form of asymmetric warfare, a tax levied on those who supported or profited from the occupation? He would likely dismiss the suffering of individual hostages as tragic, but necessary collateral damage in a total war for survival. He would present himself not as a predator, but as a pragmatist making hard choices in impossible circumstances, doing what the more respectable politicians like Moskov were too weak or too idealistic to do. His deflection to the FSB would be framed not as betrayal, but as strategic realignment. He might argue that by the early 2000s, the cause of Chechen independence had been hijacked by foreign jihadists with a global agenda alien to the Chechen people. He saw Basayev and Khattab not as brothers in arms, but as fanatics who would bring eternal war and the wrath of the world upon Chechnya. In this narrative, his deal with Moscow was a grim pact to save what could be saved, to spare Chechnya from total destruction and to preserve some element of Chechen agency. Even if it meant working with the devil, he would portray himself as a realist who saw the future and chose the only path that might lead to some form of stability, even under Russian hegemony. His subsequent abandonment and hunt by the Russians would be cited as the ultimate proof of Moscow's perfidy, a bitter lesson that no Chechen, no matter how useful, is ever truly safe in the grasp of the empire. He would likely express a deep, corrosive cynicism. He would scoff at the very concepts of international law, human rights, and journalistic objectivity. In his world, these were tools used by the powerful to discipline the weak, narratives spun by victors. He saw the true engine of the world as raw power, military, economic, and criminal, cloaked in thin justification. His entire life was a testament to acting on this belief. He would perhaps reserve his greatest contempt for the comfortable academics and commentators who would later dissect his life from a position of safety, applying moral frameworks he considered irrelevant to the kill or be killed environment he inhabited. His voice, if we could hear it, would not be that of a raving villain, but of a cold, disillusioned, and terrifyingly consistent thinker. It would be the voice of a man who looked at the social contract and saw a fiction, who looked at the state and saw a protection racket, and who simply decided to start his own, more efficient racket. This missing voice also leaves unanswered the profound personal questions. Did he love his family, and did he fear for them? Was there a moment, perhaps looking at a mountain sunset or holding a grandchild, where the full weight of his actions crushed him with remorse? Or had he compartmentalized so completely that his private self and his public role were entirely separate entities? Did he have friends, or only allies and subordinates? The historical record offers no glimpses of vulnerability, no diaries, no candid interviews. This lack of humanizing detail is what makes him such a potent symbol of pure, instrumental power. He is a silhouette, and we fill that darkness with our own understandings of evil. The silence of his victims, too, is profound. Their stories are filtered through the trauma of survival, the fragmented reports of negotiators, the cold case files of law enforcement, the true, unvarnished horror of months in a dark pit, the sound of a fellow hostage being taken away, the despair of families. These are experiences that language often fails to capture. Their silence, born of pain or of a desire to forget, is the counterweight to Atlangeriev's missing voice. Their unspoken testimony is the ultimate judgment on his life. In the end, this dialectic of silence, the missing voice of the perpetrator and the muted voice of the victim, is the truest legacy of such conflicts. It creates a history that is contested, painful, and incomplete. It allows myths to flourish on all sides. For some in Chechnya, despite everything, he might be remembered in a complex way, not as a hero, but as a Sheikh, a tough, formidable man who stood up in a time when standing up meant becoming a monster. For the Russian state, he is a closed file, bandit eliminated. For the global audience, he is a footnote in the story of post-Soviet chaos. The absence of his own voice means he belongs to no one, and to everyone he is a blank screen for projection. This is perhaps the final, fitting irony for the minister, a man who sought total control over his narrative, who operated in secrecy and demanded fear, has ultimately lost control of his story entirely. He is defined by his actions and by the interpretations of others. His inner life, his motives, his regrets, the very core of his humanity are buried deeper than his body, lost in the same fog of war that he once used so effectively as a cloak. To study Movladi Atlangeriyev, therefore, is to stare into this silence and to understand that some histories can never be fully known, only pieced together from the shattered fragments they leave behind, reminding us that the deepest truths of war and crime are often those that are felt in the gut and carried in the soul, never making it into the official record. As the final words on the life and death of Movladi Atlangeriyev are laid down, the narrative must turn from the past tense of history to the present tense of legacy, and more important, to you, the viewer who has journeyed through this long and shadowed tale. This story is not a closed book on a forgotten figure. It is a stark, living parable about the world we inhabit. A world where the lines between crime and politics, between freedom fighter and gangster, between statecraft and racketeering remain dangerously blurred in countless conflict zones from the Sahel to Southeast Asia. The journey of the minister from the ruins of the Soviet Union to a grave in Ingushetia holds a dark mirror up to our own era of fragmented sovereignties, hybrid warfare, and the relentless pursuit of resources. His empire was built on the control of hydrocarbon flows, a reminder that in the 21st century, wars and criminal empires are still fueled, quite literally, by oil and gas, whether in the Niger Delta, the Persian Gulf, or the pipelines of Eastern Europe. His use of kidnapping as a corporate enterprise finds echoes in the ransom economies of groups in the Sahara and the Philippines. His seamless movement between the roles of resistance financier and state collaborator is a playbook seen in the shifting allegiances of militia leaders in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. To understand Atlangeriyev is to acquire a lens through which to decipher the headlines from these regions, to see beyond the labels of terrorist or warlord and perceive the cold, economic engines and survivalist calculations that drive so much of contemporary conflict. His story is a vaccination against simplistic narratives. It screams that the world is not divided neatly into heroes and villains, but is off a gray morass where today's victim is tomorrow's perpetrator, where yesterday His liberator is today's tyrant, and where the pursuit of power corrupts absolutely, whether under the flag of a nation, a religion, or a private bank account, for the people of Chechnya and the North Caucasus, his legacy is a weight they still carry. It is present in the very architecture of power in Grozny, in the unspoken rules of society, in the collective memory of a time when the strong did what they could, and the weak suffered what they must. His life is a chapter in their book of martyrs and monsters, a painful reminder of a period when the dream of independence was hijacked and ultimately shattered by internal division and criminality as much as by external force. For Russia, his story is a hidden pillar in the narrative of the Putin era, a story of how chaos was subdued, not through law or justice, but through a combination of overwhelming force, cynical co-option, and the promotion of a loyal, brutal proxy. The silencing of figures like Atlangeriyev was a necessary step in the creation of the vertical of power, proving that the Kremlin would tolerate no independent sources of authority, criminal or otherwise, on its territory. His fate is a dark reflection of the system's logic. Usefulness is temporal, loyalty is absolute, and those who outlive their utility are discarded. And now, this story lands with you. You have borne witness to a chronicle of extreme ambition and brutal consequence. You have traversed the rise of a shadow state and watched it crumble into dust and blood. The purpose of this long recounting was not to glorify or to sensationalize, but to illuminate a dark corner of recent history, to provide understanding in place of mystery, and to serve as a profound caution. The call to action here is not one of violence, but of vigilance and discernment. In an information age flooded with simplistic takes and partisan narrative, the story of Movladi Atlangeriyev demands that we look deeper. When you see a conflict portrayed in black and white, remember the gray, chaotic, and morally ambiguous world of the Chechen Wars. When you hear of a powerful non-state actor, ask yourself about their funding, their internal logic, and the human cost of their power. Understand that behind every geopolitical headline about resource wars and insurgencies, there are complex human stories of survival, betrayal, and ambition, often as dark and tangled as this one. This knowledge is a form of power. It immunizes you against propaganda. It fosters empathy for victims caught in impossible situations. It encourages a more nuanced and critical engagement with the world. Therefore, the final call to action is this: carry this story with you. Let it be a reference point. Share this video with others who seek to understand the complex undercurrents of modern history. Like this video to signal that deep research content matters. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because the past is not dead. It is a key to the present, and this channel is dedicated to turning that key to bringing you the hidden stories that shape our world. The story of the minister is over, but the forces that created him, greed, ambition, state failure, the curse of natural resources, are very much alive. Your awareness is the first step in ensuring that such stories remain history, not prophecy. You have spent this time in the company of a ghost from a recent war. Do not let his lessons be buried with him. Take them into the light, discuss them, and let them sharpen your view of the power dynamics that silently govern our age. This is the true end of Movladi Atlangeriyev's tale, not in a grave in Ingushetia, but in the informed conscience of those who have heard it. Thank you for listening.